clock above the break room microwave blinked 5:04 p.m. Its neon red digits flickered, casting a faint glow against the faded bulletin board cluttered with old flyers, potluck sign-ups, CPR class notices, and a happy retirement banner half-heartedly taped to the drywall. Margaret Collins sat alone with a cup of lukewarm coffee. The white paper cup bore a smudge of her mauve lipstick, and the drink inside had long since turned bitter. Still, she cradled it like it held something more than caffeine, like it held 30 years of memories. 30 years. She'd worked at Oak Ridge Family Medical Practice since Andrew was in diapers. She was barely in her 30s when her husband left, walked out with nothing but a duffel bag and a vague excuse about not being cut out for family life. From then on, it had been Margaret against the world, single motherhood, long hours, 2 jobs for a while, always one car repair away from disaster, but Andrew never knew. She'd made sure of it. And now, she was here, 65, retired, with a gold-framed certificate and a chocolate sheet cake bearing her name in cursive frosting. The party had lasted 20 minutes, a few hugs, some polite laughter. Julia from pediatrics had even cried a little, but Margaret, she felt weightless, not free, not yet, but lighter. Seeing Andrew's house, that evening, the sun was dipping low as Margaret pulled into the long stone driveway of her son's home. It was everything her modest apartment was not. 3-car garage, polished landscaping, soft golden lights warming the porch. Melissa, Andrew's wife, had insisted they host her retirement dinner at their place. "It'll be intimate," she'd said. The moment Margaret walked in, she could feel it. The atmosphere was glossy, but cold, like a showroom kitchen. The silverware gleamed, the wine glasses sparkled, but nothing felt lived in. Melissa floated over, wearing a cream blouse and forced smile. "Welcome, Margaret," she said, pecking the air near Margaret's cheek. "Congratulations again. Andrew's just finishing the C-Bus." Margaret smiled politely. "Thank you, dear." They sat at the table, Andrew at the head, Melissa to his right, Margaret across from them like a guest at her own celebration. Small talk fluttered the weather, school updates for the grandkids, Melissa's yoga studio expansion. Then Margaret folded her napkin and took a breath. "I wanted to tell you both something tonight," she began. Andrew looked up from his plate. Fork paused in midair. "I've decided to retire," Margaret said softly. "Today was my last day." There was a pause, a quiet so sharp it buzzed. Andrew frowned. "Wait. What? I've worked long enough. I want to enjoy a little peace while I still have the health for it." Melissa tilted her head. "Oh, okay. That's sudden." Andrew put his fork down. "What are you going to do? Just sit around and become a burden to everyone?" The words landed like a slap. Margaret blinked. "A burden, I just mean. You're still perfectly capable. Retirement's for people who need to slow down, not for people who still have responsibilities." Margaret's hand stiffened on her napkin. "What responsibilities?" Andrew hesitated. Melissa stepped in. "Melissa, well, we assumed you'd continue helping out with Emma's activities, with the house, and, certain expenses. Expenses. That word again. Margaret had been paying part of their mortgage for 2 years, quietly, willingly, until now. "I'm not asking for anything," she said calmly. "I'm simply letting you know I've stepped down." Andrew scoffed. "Well, maybe you should have stepped up instead. You know how tight things are." A silence fell, not the gentle kind, the kind that swells in your chest and chokes the room. Margaret stood. "I think I'll head home. Thank you for dinner." Melissa blinked, caught off guard. Already we were going to have dessert. No need. Margaret replied. Her voice was steady, but her heart had already left. Closing thought. 30 years of sacrifice, And the moment she stopped giving, she became disposable. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that Margaret Collins was finally ready to stop surviving and start living. Coming up in Chapter 2. From mother to mooch, Margaret moves in with Andrew and Melissa temporarily and learns just how quickly love can turn conditional. 2 weeks after the dinner, Margaret stood at the edge of Andrew's foyer, a duffel bag at her feet and her hands tightly clasped in front of her. The marble tiles beneath her looked more like they belonged in a museum than a home. Melissa appeared from around the corner, balancing a glass of wine in one hand and her phone in the other. "You made good time," she said, glancing at the clock. "Andrew's in the office. Come on, let me show you to the guest suite." Margaret nodded silently and followed. The guest suite was more sterile than warm white bedding, abstract art, a scented diffuser humming in the corner with notes of lavender and something chemical. There were no photos, no books, no signs of family. Still, Margaret smiled. She was grateful, or, at least, she tried to be. Seeing first impressions fade. The first few days were manageable. Margaret made herself useful folded laundry, ran errands, even prepped a lasagna one evening. She never asked for anything, didn't use the hot water too long, kept the TV volume low. But subtle things began to change. A printed chart appeared on the fridge. Quiet hours 9 p.m. 7 a.m. No kitchen use after 8:30 p.m. Her name wasn't on the Wi-Fi password sheet, and every time she sat on the living room couch, Melissa seemed to suddenly need the space for her morning meditation. One evening, Margaret reached for a snack while Melissa and her mother, Patricia, chatted in the kitchen. "Oh," Patricia said with a sugar-slick tone. "I didn't realize we were running a boarding house now." Melissa laughed, not even glancing Margaret's way. "She's just staying until she figures things out." Scene 10's request. A week later, Andrew found Margaret on the patio, pruning a wilting plant. "Hey, Mom," he said casually, hands in his pockets. "Can we talk for a second?" She wiped her hands on a dish towel. "Of course." He handed her a manila folder. "There's a small business opportunity I've been eyeing, a wellness studio. I need a co-signer. It's a good deal, low risk, high return." Margaret flipped through the documents. "You want me to co-sign a $100,000 loan?" "Well, yeah. You've always helped before." "I'm retired, Andrew," she said gently. "I'm on a fixed income. I can't take on that kind of risk." His face darkened. "Wow. After everything I've done for you?" She blinked. "Everything you've done for me, I let you move in. Didn't I?" Her voice stayed calm. "You didn't let me. You said you wanted me here. You insisted. That was before you started acting like a roommate who doesn't pay rent." Margaret's throat tightened. "I'm your mother." "And I'm not your charity case," he snapped, turning and walking inside. Seeing the final blow that night, Margaret found a note on her nightstand, handwritten, tidy cursive. "Margaret, we've been re-evaluating our family's needs and financial direction, given your decision to no longer contribute. We believe it's best for everyone if you find your own living arrangements. We appreciate your understanding. Melissa and Andrew." Not even a conversation, just a decision, like returning a defective product. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed, the letter trembling in her hand. Her eyes didn't well with tears, not yet. Not this time. She folded the paper neatly, placed it in her purse. Then she picked up her duffel bag and quietly began to pack. Closing thought. They had reduced her to a line item in their budget, tolerated when she paid, disposable when she didn't, but what they hadn't calculated was what Margaret was truly worth. Coming up in Chapter 3, Exit and Inheritance, Margaret leaves with nothing, only to receive a letter that changes everything. The morning she left Andrew's house, the sky was a dull gray overcast, low-hanging clouds pressing down on the neighborhood like an unspoken truth. Margaret didn't ask for a ride. She didn't want one. She didn't want a goodbye either. She wheeled her suitcase down the driveway by herself. No one came to the door. No Emma. No goodbye hug from her granddaughter. No final glance from Melissa. Just the faint sound of a blender in the kitchen and the clink of glassware. Life continuing without her. Scene returned to solitude. Back at her old apartment complex, Margaret unlocked the door and stepped into the musty quiet. It smelled faintly of dust and lavender, the scent of old books and lonely corners. The furniture was gone, sold when Andrew said, "You won't need that stuff anymore." Now. She sat on a twin-sized air mattress with a blanket from the thrift store. Her only decoration was a framed photo of young Andrew, maybe age 7, beaming from the seat of a rusted bicycle she'd saved 3 months' salary to buy. She stared at the photo for a long time. She didn't cry. She made tea. Scene a letter arrives. It came in a plain white envelope, Monroe and Associates, Estate Law Division, stamped in bold across the top. Margaret almost threw it out, thinking it was junk mail, but something intuition. Curiosity made her open it. Inside was a formal letter and a check. She had to read the page 3 times before it registered. Dr. Lena Monroe, a longtime patient, had passed away and left Margaret everything. In recognition of her kindness, integrity, and many quiet acts of compassion over the years, Margaret Collins is to inherit the full contents of my estate, including $1.2 million in liquid assets. My residence at 24 Riverside Grove. Personal art and collectibles I trust she will use it to finally live for herself. To a heart. Margaret lowered the page slowly. Her hands trembled, but not from shock. From the sensation of something unfamiliar settling into her chest. Power, freedom, a second chance. Scene remembering. Dr. Monroe. She remembered Lena Monroe well, the way she always wore crimson lipstick, even during chemo, the way she laughed like every moment mattered, how she once told Margaret, "You're the most invisible kind of angel, the kind who never asks for anything." They'd become close near the end. Margaret had sat with her on stormy nights when Lena couldn't sleep. She'd driven her to treatments. They had cried over old jazz records, and never not once had Margaret done it expecting anything in return, which, apparently, is why Lena had noticed her the most. Scene the first visit to Riverside Grove. A week later, Margaret stood in front of the gates of Riverside Estates. She had borrowed a friend's car, gripping the steering wheel with white knuckles the entire drive. The community was like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Manicured gardens, cobblestone paths, iron lanterns that flickered with golden light at dusk. She pulled into the driveway of 24 Riverside Grove, slowly stepping out, the gravel crunching beneath her sensible flats. The house was modest by Riverside standards, a 2-bedroom craftsman-style bungalow with a wraparound porch and ivy climbing the posts. But to Margaret, it was a palace. She unlocked the front door. The air smelled like cedar and lemon, hardwood floors, sunlight pouring in through skylights, a reading nook by the window, a kitchen with granite countertops and hand-painted tiles, an upright piano with sheet music still resting on the stand. She exhaled slowly, and then she laughed. A quiet, breathless, startled laugh, like someone who had forgotten the sound of her own joy. Scene the mirror. That night, Margaret stood in the bathroom, staring at herself in the mirror for the first time in years. She looked different, not older, not younger, just present. She said it aloud. "I am not a burden." Her voice echoed in the silence. She said it again. "I am not disposable." And for the first time since Andrew's betrayal, she believed it. Closing thought. They had shown her the door, but fate had shown her the front gate of a life they never imagined she could have. And Margaret was just getting started. Next up, in Chapter 4, A Life Unburdened, Margaret settles into her new home, forms new friendships, and learns how to say yes to herself without guilt. The first morning Margaret woke up in Riverside Grove. She thought she was dreaming. The sheets were Egyptian cotton. The mattress didn't squeak when she rolled over. And sunlight, honest, golden, storybook sunlight poured through the open curtains and kissed her face like an invitation. For a moment, she simply lay there, listening to the birds and the soft hush of the river beyond the trees. No banging pots, no passive-aggressive footsteps outside her bedroom door, no one expecting anything. She got up, she brewed a fresh pot of coffee, not instant, and sat on the wraparound porch in her robe, legs tucked beneath her like a schoolgirl. She didn't turn on the news, she didn't check her phone, she watched the wind stir the leaves, she listened to herself breathe. Seen a home that feels like hers. Over the next week, Margaret made the house her own. She painted the reading nook a soft sage green. She filled the kitchen shelves with her mother's old recipe books she'd packed away when she thought she'd never have a kitchen of her own again. In the evenings, she played Lena Monroe's old upright piano. Her fingers stumbled at first, but the muscle memory returned Claire de Lune, just enough of it to make her eyes wool up. She framed a photo of young Andrew and placed it on the mantel, not out of obligation, but love. A different kind of love now, one with boundaries. Seeing Grace returns. On a breezy Thursday afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Margaret opened it to find a familiar face, Grace Walker, a retired RN she'd worked with decades ago. "Well, I nearly fell off my porch when I heard that Margaret Collins bought the Monroe place," Grace grinned. "Didn't believe it until I saw your name on the mailbox." Margaret laughed. "Come in." "Grace, I just made lemon tea." They sat by the kitchen island, catching up. Grace was as spirited as ever, silver curls tucked under a wide-brimmed straw hat, a chunky turquoise necklace jangling every time she gestured. "Everyone in town's talking," Grace said, sipping her tea. "You finally getting what you deserve." Margaret chuckled. "I don't know about deserve, but I'll tell you what, this is the first time I've ever had a porch swing." Grace leaned in. "It suits you." And for the first time, Margaret believed it. Seen saying yes to herself, Margaret started saying yes. Yes to the book club at the local library, where she met women who debated Austen and Morrison over blueberry scones. Yes to a watercolor class at the community center, where she painted wildflowers with bold colors and an unsteady but joyful hand. Yes to herself, her time, her comfort, her choices. She volunteered at a literacy nonprofit, helping adults learn to read. She donated anonymously to the local women's shelter. She sponsored the scholarship at the medical school where Lena had once taught. She never once boasted, never once posted about it, because freedom, she'd learned, didn't need applause. Seen a whisper from the past one afternoon as she was pruning the small rose garden out front. Margaret heard two neighborhood women talking at the gate. "I heard she used to live with her son." One whispered, "Poor thing." "They say he threw her out," the other replied. "Then God must have thrown her a lifeline." Margaret didn't flinch. She didn't hide. She stood up, wiped her hands on her apron, and waved. "Ladies," she called, "there's fresh lemonade if you want to come in." They blinked, surprised, then smiled and walked toward the porch. Closing thought. She wasn't just building a life, she was becoming one. No longer defined by what she'd given, but by who she was when no one was watching and no one was asking. Coming next in Chapter 5, the battle begins. When Andrew learns about Margaret's inheritance, he doesn't show up with humility, he shows up with paperwork. The first sign of trouble wasn't a knock at the door. It was a letter, thick, official, marked with Andrew's name, Collins and Associates Real Estate Holdings, LLC, and delivered by courier on a Monday morning, tucked between a gardening catalog and a Riverside newsletter. Margaret stood on the porch in her robe, the sunlight warming her back as she flipped it over in her hands. Her stomach sank before she even opened it. Inside was a cover letter from a law office, cold, clinical, on behalf of Mr. Andrew Collins. We request immediate clarification of the origin and legality of the recent inheritance granted to Ms. Margaret Collins. She stopped reading. The last page said it all. Our client reserves the right to pursue legal action should the matter not be resolved amicably. Seeing the confrontation. 3 days later, Andrew showed up unannounced. Margaret opened the door and was struck by how small he looked on her porch. No suit jacket, just a polo shirt and eyes full of bitterness. He held no flowers, no apology, just a thin folder clutched in his hand like a weapon. "Hi, Mom," he said flatly. She stepped aside. "Andrew." He walked into the living room slowly, taking in the decor, the books on the shelf, the piano. "This is nicer than I expected," he muttered. Margaret folded her arms. "I assume you're not here for a tour?" He turned sharply. "I just want to know the truth. Did you manipulate that woman?" She was sick, vulnerable. Margaret blinked. "Lena Monroe was more mentally sound in her final weeks than you've been in the last 5 years. Don't," he snapped. "Don't act like you're some saint. You were living in my house. I was living in a guest room, treated like a squatter. You never said no before. And suddenly, you're rolling in millions." Margaret's voice was calm, but her chest tightened. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't expect it. But I will not apologize for being chosen by someone who saw my worth when my own son didn't." Andrew's eyes dropped. "You could have told me." He mumbled, "You never would have heard me." Seeing the lawsuit, the court summons came a week later. Andrew had filed a legal challenge to contest Lena Monroe's will, alleging that Margaret had exerted undue influence during Lena's final months. The Riverside community buzzed. Whispers at the book club, raised eyebrows at the garden shop. A woman at the library whispered, "Is it true her son's suing her?" Margaret sat at her kitchen table late at night, fingers wrapped around a cooling mug of tea, rereading Lena's handwritten letters, dozens of them, thanking her for everything from driving her to radiation treatments, to reading to her when her eyesight faded, to staying through the storm when no one else came. Lena had known exactly what she was doing. So did Margaret. Seeing the courtroom. On the day of the hearing, Margaret wore her navy blue dress, the one she had once saved for church or funerals. She sat quietly at the front, her lawyer beside her. Andrew, across the aisle, looked tense. Melissa was there too, stone-faced in a cream suit, whispering to their attorney. Margaret's lawyer read the letters aloud, one by one. A letter where Lena wrote, "Margaret Collins is the kindest, most loyal woman I've ever known. She has cared for me without asking for anything, not money, not recognition. This gift is mine to give, and I give it gladly." Witnesses were called, nurses, neighbors, even Lena's niece, who stated clearly, "My aunt didn't trust many people, but she trusted Margaret like a sister." Andrew looked down as the judge read the decision aloud. "There is no credible evidence of coercion. The will stands. Case dismissed." Scene outside the courthouse. Margaret stepped into the sunlight. A breeze stirred the air. A small crowd had gathered. Someone from the local paper asked, "Miss Dunbar, Collins, do you have anything to say?" She paused, then, calmly, "I gave freely for most of my life. I've never asked for recognition or reward, but I will not allow anyone formally or not to rewrite my story out of shame or greed." She turned and walked away. Andrew stood frozen near the steps. She didn't say goodbye. He didn't call after her. Closing thought. Some storms come to wash things clean. Others come to show you who was never shelter at all. Margaret had walked through the fire, and this time she didn't come out burned. She came out blazing, coming next in Chapter 6, The Quiet Apology. After the dust settles, Andrew returns, but not with demands, with regret. It had been 4 weeks since the courthouse hearing, 4 weeks since Margaret Collins walked out of the courtroom and into her new life, a life no longer tethered to guilt or expectation. In that time, spring had tiptoed into Oak Ridge. The magnolia trees lining Riverside Grove had begun to bloom, painting the sidewalks in soft pastels. Margaret spent her mornings painting by the bay window, her afternoons sipping mint tea with the neighbor's golden retriever curled up at her feet. She was healing. But healing doesn't mean forgetting. It was a rainy Thursday when the next message came. Scene. The message from Andrew. Margaret was organizing the linen closet when her phone buzzed. Andrew? Again. But this time, it wasn't a voicemail. It was a text. I understand if you don't want to talk, but I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Really sorry. For how I treated you. For the money. For everything. You deserved better. You always did. Margaret sat on the edge of her bed, phone in hand, heart heavy, but still. For a moment, she closed her eyes. She could still hear his voice from that awful night. You're just going to sit around and become a burden. The sting hadn't completely faded, but it no longer controlled her. She stood, walked to her dresser, and pulled open the top drawer. There it was, the letter Lena Monroe had written, still crisp, still folded with care. Margaret reread the final line. There's nothing richer than peace of mind. Don't spend it on people who only know how to take. Seeing Rosa's kitchen table. That evening, Margaret sat at Rosa's kitchen table, nursing a cup of hot cinnamon tea. Rosa raised an eyebrow. So, did he apologize with actual words, or just vague regret energy? Margaret smiled. Words, full sentences, punctuation and everything. Rosa stirred her tea. And I haven't answered. Do you want to? Margaret thought about it. About the years she'd spent swallowing her truth to keep the peace. The birthdays she paid for. The tears she cried behind closed doors. The cruel comments. The silence. And yet, I don't know, she said honestly. But I don't want to carry anger either. It's too heavy. Rosa reached across the table and squeezed her hand. You don't owe him forgiveness, but you do owe yourself freedom. Margaret nodded. Freedom. See in the coffee shop meeting. Saturday morning, she sent a reply. Let's talk. 1 hour. No money. No favors. Just you and me. The coffee shop on Main. She wasn't sure if he'd show, but at 10:58 a.m., the bell above the cafe door jingled. Andrew walked in alone. He looked older, not physically, but emotionally, as if the weight he'd once dropped on her shoulders had finally landed on his own. Margaret sat with a latte in front of her. She didn't smile, but she didn't scowl either. Hi, Mom, he said, voice low. She nodded. Hello? Andrew? He sat, fidgeted with the sleeve of his jacket. I don't really know how to start. Start with the truth. He looked up, eyes wet. I was selfish. Melissa was too. We saw you as a resource, not a person, not a mother, just someone who was always there to fix things. Margaret stayed quiet. He continued. And when you finally stopped, I got scared. Because without your help, I had to look at who I had become. And it wasn't pretty. There was a long silence. Then she spoke. I spent 30 years pouring everything I had into you, not because I expected anything, but because I believed that love meant showing up. Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. But I deserved to be loved back, not tolerated, not used. Andrew's voice was barely a whisper. I know. Seen a new beginning, not a reset. They didn't hug. There were no grand gestures, no violin swells, no sweeping apologies that fixed everything in an hour. But there was something else. Respect. Andrew didn't ask for anything. Margaret didn't offer. They talked about Emma's piano recital, about the way Patricia had moved in with Melissa full-time. It's a lot, he admitted, chuckling awkwardly. They even laughed once, and when they parted, Margaret said something she never thought she would. You're welcome to visit me sometime. But only if you're coming as my son, not as someone looking for a safety net. Andrew nodded. I'd like that. And he meant it. Scene epilogue. The paintings in the gallery. Weeks later. Margaret's paintings, once hidden in dusty closets, now hung in a small art space just outside Oak Ridge. Late bloomers art by women. Over 60 read the sign. Rosa had submitted Margaret's work without telling her. I knew you'd say no. She shrugged. But the world needs to see your color. On opening night, the gallery was buzzing, neighbors came, nurses from her old job. Even the coffee shop owner brought tulips. At the far end of the room, Andrew stood beside a watercolor of a magnolia tree in bloom. He looked proud, not of the money she had, but of the woman she had become. Margaret didn't need to be rescued. She never had. Closing thought. Sometimes, the richest revenge is no revenge at all. Sometimes, it's peace. It's building a life so beautiful. Even those who once overlooked you can't help but admire it now. Coming next in the final chapter. Riverside Peace, Margaret finally finds the kind of family that chooses her, and a future that belongs entirely to herself. The morning sun stretched across the hardwood floors like warm honey. The new curtains, light linen with blue trim, danced gently in the breeze coming off the water. Margaret stood at her kitchen island, slicing strawberries into a porcelain bowl, her robe tied loosely at the waist, hair still a little damp from the shower. This was hers. Not borrowed, not temporary, not built for someone else's comfort. It had been 6 months since she'd walked away from Oak Ridge's old wounds. 6 months since she'd stopped explaining herself. 6 months since she'd started over, and she had never felt more whole. Scene Sunday morning in Riverside Estates. Riverside Estates wasn't just luxury. It was quiet, friendly. The kind of neighborhood where people waved when they passed. And neighbors dropped off lemon bars just because. Margaret's home was modest, by estate standards. A single-story cottage with a garden out front, an art room in the back, and a view of the lake that made mornings feel like postcards. She'd spent her first few weeks rearranging furniture until it felt right. She'd donated all the things that once tied her to gild Andrew's broken college lamp, Patricia's old casserole dish, even the faux china Melissa had gifted her for appearances. She replaced them with books, succulents, and paintings of her own, paintings full of wind, of color, of stillness and space. Rosa visited often. Sometimes they sat in the sunroom with tea and crossword puzzles. Other times, they said nothing, just sat with the silence and let it be. "This place looks like you finally exhaled," Rosa said one day. Sipping from a mug that said, "Still got it," Margaret smiled. "I did." Scene the unexpected visitor. One afternoon in early June, as Margaret clipped roses from the trellis, a car pulled into her driveway. She didn't recognize it right away, but when the door opened and Emma stepped out, now taller. With her hair in a braid and a nervous smile, Margaret's heart stuttered. Behind her, Andrew stood by the passenger door, hands in his pockets. No assumptions, no swagger, just stillness. Emma held out a small potted plant. "It's a forget-me-not," she said, voice shy. I picked it out. Margaret knelt down, dirt on her gloves, eyes wet. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." Andrew cleared his throat. "She asked to come. I just drove." Margaret nodded. "You're welcome to stay. There's lemonade inside." Seen a garden. Replanted. They sat in the backyard. Emma sipped lemonade while Margaret showed her the hummingbird feeder and the rosemary bush she'd planted in April. Andrew sat quietly, observing, at one point. Emma turned to her father and said, "Dad said you paint stuff that feels like breathing." Margaret laughed. "That's kind of him. I just paint what I never had time to see before." Emma tilted her head. "Can I try sometime?" Margaret took her hand gently. "Anytime. Later." As the sun began to dip behind the tree line, Andrew stood. "I won't stay long. I just wanted her to see that I was wrong." He looked at his mother, not as a child looking for shelter, but as a man acknowledging truth. "You deserved better. And if it ever feels right, maybe we can build something, slowly." Margaret looked at him for a long moment, then said softly, "Slow is fine." He smiled, eyes glassy. "Take care, Mom." When he drove away, Emma stayed behind. Seeing the sketchpad. That evening, Margaret opened a fresh sketchpad. On the first page, she drew a girl holding a small blue flower, sunlight caught in her braid, standing beside a garden fence. Above it, she wrote, "Some things grow again, even when you thought the roots were gone." She closed the book and placed it by the window. The lake shimmered under the rising moon. Final closing. Thought. Sometimes the richest revenge isn't revenge at all, it's peace. It's waking up in a house you chose, sipping coffee you brewed, surrounded by things that make you feel seen, not used. And sometimes, if you're lucky, the people who once hurt you come back not to take, but to say thank you, and you get to choose if you open the door or just smile from the garden.